And when we speak, we are afraid that our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. Audre Lorde. When it is the police, we remain silent. When it is rape, we remain silent. When it is someone famous, someone popular, someone powerful, we remain silent. Of all rape victims, we have the right to require silence because we think no one is innocent, not even the innocent, but not ever the victims. We make them complicit. We're told when we are young who we can go to feel safe. Tell the police, tell your teacher, tell your preacher. Who do you tell when those charged with your protection, those tasked to give you service, slide their badges over your body, shove their chalk down your throat, get you drunk on the blood of Jesus, then tell you that your silence will protect you? The numbers tell me that nothing will protect me or you, like how since 1976, 1,559 people have been executed on death row, but over 19,000 have been murdered by police. Just to note, when this poem was first written in 2014, the number of death row executions was 1,479. The number of murders by police was over 14,000. The number for death row executions changed from now to then by 55. The number for police numbers changed by over 5,000. These numbers were pulled from the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank that analyzes FBI data on police violence. I also want to make a note that the numbers I just read you might have ticked up since then. So go double check those statistics. It's just a good one check. Backhand. Like how most sexual conduct, like how sexual misconduct is the second highest form of police brutality. Like how you're more likely to get raped by a cop than someone on the street. Like how Oklahoma City cop Daniel Holtzclaw can face over 32 charges of first-degree rape, forcible sodomy, and sexual battery and still get freed on bail and still get thousands in donations because him getting punished for raping Black women is seen as the real injustice. Like how 51% of all sexual violence committed by police is against minors, like how 60% of Black women get raped before they turn 18, like how every woman I know has either been raped or her sister or her mama or her daughter or her friend or her cousin or her coworker or her classmate has been raped, like how men get raped, but no one ever wants to talk about that because we don't even like to talk about women getting raped. Like how trans and gender non-conforming people get raped, but no one ever wants to talk about that because those refusing to be binary somehow don't count as people, especially when they get raped. Like how children get raped, but no one ever wants to talk about that because we don't ever want to talk about anybody getting raped. Like how sex is the weapon when it comes to rape, not the actual point, because rapists hardly ever come and hardly ever close to justice. With thousands of untested rape kits languishing in basements of police stations nationwide, why am I talking about rape when I'm supposed to be talking about how we can't breathe? This PTSD, this complex PTSD, takes my breath away, takes my days, turns them into tears, takes my joys, turns them into terrors, takes my life until I swallow darkness of silence to keep the kind of sanity that makes everyone else more comfortable than I will ever be. I have never been able to breathe. I hold my stomach in unintentionally, have held it in for decades, trying to hold myself together. Held it in so long that it hurts to pee, to sing, to sleep, to speak. Everyone tells me that my silence will protect me, just like the police were supposed to protect me, just like the church should be my sanctuary, just like schools and workshops and poetry were supposed to liberate me, but I still can't breathe. Because the movement ain't trying to get me free when rape is so pervasive that those trying to uplift the masses do their best to try to uplift some asses, then press fingers in the screen saying, just move with me, not against me, saying, keep this our secret. No one will believe you anyway. Gluttons for power will always gorge themselves on those they perceive as. What is most terrifying to the powerful are the weak realizing their strength. There's no keeping of the secret when the dead are resurrected through the anger of the living. There's no keeping of secrets when the raped find their justice in the telling of what happened. There is no keeping of the secret that the system of America was built between the thighs of captured dark women, was built inside the grooves of bloody Black backs, built on top of bones red and feathered with colonizing cruelty. When the desecrated begin to assess the damage, demand what was stolen be returned, demand what was broken be repaired, demand what was destroyed be restored, demand what was betrayed be reconciled by the awful searing truth in the breath, will demand its rightful place. The breath will command its rightful space to matter, to shatter this silence that will never protect us. We matter. Black lives matter. Black lives, women, trans, lesbian, gay, gender nonconforming, men, children, raped, beaten, arrested, unprotected, exploited, poor, policed, and all in between. Black lives matter, and so we must. Oh, why am I talking about all that when I'm supposed to be talking about grade? Well, this all came about, surviving the mic came about, even my work in sexual violence came about because of everything that I just talked about in that poem. It came about because I was a teacher a very long time ago at an organization here in Chicago called Young Chicago Authors. Young Chicago Authors produced a poetry slam, maybe they still do, called Louder Than a Bomb. Louder Than a Bomb, as far as I know, is still the world's largest teen poetry slam, which brings together hundreds of teen poets from Chicago every single year. I was on one of the original production teams for that. I started in year 2. If you've ever heard of Wordplay, their open mic, I also coordinated that. As a matter of fact, I named it. So me and this work goes back very, very long. There's a reason, though, why I'm no longer affiliated with Young Chicago Authors or Louder Than a Bomb. And that reason is because one of my students very early on in 2005 came to me and told me that she was sexually assaulted by a fellow teaching artist who at the time was around 28 and she was 15. And I asked her, what would you like me to do? Is there anything you would like me to do? What would you like to do? Would you like to go to the police? Would you like to tell the organization? What do you need? And how can I help? I knew to say that, even though I had not yet been involved in that work, because my mom was a rape victim advocate back in the day, and a good friend of mine who was a survivor was also a volunteer with our. And they told me, you don't tell survivors what to do. You ask survivors what they would like to do, and then you figure out how you can be supportive, if you can be supportive. She told me she didn't want to tell anyone. She didn't want to go to the police. She just wanted to pretend like none of it happened. He was at the time a very, very well-known spoken word artist. And she felt like he was so popular and so well-liked that no one would believe her. This is actually pretty common in spoken word circles. As we would find out in the years to come, it actually happens in spoken word communities throughout the United States, which is all I know about personally. It might happen throughout the world. It probably does. The reason why it happens in those spaces particularly is because, let's put this in context, right? So I said 2005. At the time, I was 22, so pretty young. I was, I wasn't 22 then. I started teaching when I was 22. I was like closer to like my mid-20s around. So I was like 26, 27. Still, my oldest students were like 18, right? So when I first started teaching, there was maybe a 4-year difference between me and some of my students. And because we were teaching poetry and not like officially like a teacher in the school, it also meant that I would go to parties on the weekend, just like parties, like I had a boyfriend who was a few years younger than me. We'd hang out with his friends, and lo and behold, my students would pop up. You know how awkward it is to stand in a circle and like tell your student like, no, don't pass me the lunch, right? It's awkward, right? And nobody at that point had taught us how to maintain those boundaries. Like I probably shouldn't have been at those parties, or when I saw them come in, I should have like left. But I didn't know any better. I was in my early 20s. I was an artist. I was teaching to make some extra money on the side. I was in like my, second or third band at that time. I wasn't thinking about any of that, right? None of it. But when my student came to me and told me that, my thinking on it shifted radically. Because then I started to think about things from her perspective. 15, coming into a poetry workshop for the first time. Her teacher was a man of color, of the same ethnic group as she was. And so to be able to talk about the things that she wanted to talk about with a teacher who really could relate and connect with a lot of those experiences was like a first time thing for her. When I think about it now, it was a first time thing for a lot of our students back then, right? And so we didn't do a good job of caring for them. We didn't have any guidelines in place. We didn't put any good boundaries in place. We didn't train each other or ourselves on how to receive reports like this from young people. We didn't know what the protocol was. In Illinois, if you work with young people on any level, even as a guest teaching artist or whatever, you're still what's called a mandated reporter, which means by law, if they say, hey, I've been hurt in this way, you have to pick up the phone and call someone and tell someone about that. We didn't know that. We didn't even have the number for that. I couldn't have told you back then what mandated reporting was, right? But when I found out what happened to my student, I went to that organization that my mom and my friend volunteered at. And I said, what should we do? And they gave me a whole long list of workshops and other things. And so I decided to go to the leadership of that organization. And I said, listen, she doesn't want to do anything. She doesn't want anyone to know that this happened to her, but we also can't maintain this kind of environment. We need to do something now. This is the first one that we know about, but we need to stop this. And I gave them all the information and the information about the organization, and they said, thank you. And that was it. So I quit. And then I went to go work at Rape Connecticut, and I became their prevention educator. And that is the story of not only how, that's the story of like the biggest turning point in my life, I would say, profession. It's when I stopped being an artist and I really leaned into being an activist and an advocate and an organizer. So here we are, many years later, almost 20 years later now. And what's interesting is that in 2021, if you go back and Google this, there were many newspaper articles produced in and around Chicago about what happened in Chicago. One of them from the Chicago Reader quotes me fairly extensively about all of it. What's funny is that they don't start the clock until 2013. My clock started in 2005. It's also interesting that the reason why that story broke is that a very prominent white man who runs a poetry organization, Button Poetry, spoke up on behalf of another former student of YCA, who's also a very well-known writer, Fatima Ashgar. And that is what made the media pay attention. But long before he spoke up, there were plenty of folks of color and women of color who spoke up. And we were basically gaslit and told that we were wrong, we were hyping it up, we're being oversensitive. And so in that 16-year window between 2005 when I spoke up and 2021 when that article got published, just to let you know what happens when people just don't decide to do anything, 6 more artists were accused of sexual violence. Half of them confessed to it. Okay, so that's not 6 victims, that's just 6 perpetrators. The list of victims is too numerous for me to count, but that's under one umbrella of one organization over a 16-year period. Any place that said, hey, we have these many people who have either been accused of or confessed to perpetrating sexual harm, somebody would take a look at that. Somebody would be like, oh my God, what is going on? And finally in 2021, that happened. So in 2014, which is the official start of Surviving the Mic, we were sort of born out of the genesis of this sort of spoken word situation, right? And really what we're talking about here is that we're talking about power dynamics, which, as all of you know, if you know anything about sexual violence, that is what it's about. It's not about attraction. It's not, to me, even about sexuality, right? It's about power dynamics. This is about people who ultimately get off on that sense of control and power over someone else. In a situation where you have somebody who is a teacher, there's a reason why teachers and students dating each other is not really a thing, right? Because of the power dynamic of you as the teacher in control and the person who's the student who's like sort of under that control, right? When you also add in the social and cultural power of someone, right? Which is why like people get so shocked when they hear about celebrities as predators, and I'm never shocked because they actually fit the profile of your common predator, which is somebody who for the most part is powerful, dynamic, charming, usually gets along really well with people, can build relationships with people really, really, really easily. They're approachable. People like to, they're dynamic. People like to be around them and be around that energy. And that social and cultural power, that level of popularity also is a form of power and control. This teaching artist, while not the most famous like spoken word artist on the planet, not even close, at that time, had enough social and cultural power that if he had put the word out about her, her reputation would have been destroyed forever. If he just said, don't take her seriously as a writer, it would have been a wrap and nobody would have paid attention to her on any level, right? And she's aware of that. Most of us are aware of that when we're in the power of people who we feel like make us and on some levels break us. And so when you add that all into a classroom dynamic, also you are again located in time. This is before YouTube, this is before social media, this is right in the pocket when HBO's Def Poetry Jam really started. And that's a big deal because that was the first time that spoken word was really consumed on a mainstream level. As somebody who also was featured on that show, I can tell you that for like a couple of years, people made me feel real famous. Thankfully, I have a 10-year-old right now who makes me feel the exact opposite. It's good sense of balance, right? So Surviving the Mic came about when earlier that year in 2013, right? So we started in January of 2014. In 2013, there was a national poetry slam, and they have what's called a Slam Masters meeting. At that meeting, every person who runs poetry slams in the United States was in that room. And all these allegations of sexual violence came out, and it was just excuse my expression, a shit show. People were yelling, people were screaming, people didn't know legally what they could do, what they couldn't do. And the whole community was just kind of torn apart. Lots of yelling, lots of, like, if you can imagine, National Poetry Slam every year is like summer camp for the geekiest poets you've ever met in your life. And within this little group or circle of people, there's a certain level of popularity because you're known to like maybe 1,000 people in the United States, but you're really known, they really love you. So there's like a lot at stake, right? So when folks started getting outed as predators in this Slam Masters meeting, it felt devastating to some. One of the people who was accused is a pretty well-known poet. He's been nominated for a National Book Award. He's traveled and performed all over the world. In other words, brought a lot of money for a lot of these smaller venues. So saying, oh, we're not going to feature him or we're not going to book him wasn't a thing because there were financial like repercussions to this too. I'm giving you all of this like background and context so that you can understand where our notion of making a brave space came from. Because after that point, you have to locate me in time too, right? I started doing my thing and performing in 1998. So we're in 2013. So I'm well over a decade into my arts career. I just had my first son. I was like knee deep in my graduate program. In other words, I actually wasn't thinking about any of this stuff, right? I had tried my best to leave it all behind. And what ended up happening is that when I saw this at Slam Masters and coming out of even my graduate school experience of being in writing workshops with work that, as you just heard, is pretty vulnerable. And I cover some really intense topics. One thing about me, and anyone who knows me, whether they like me or don't like me, one thing that they will all agree on is that Nikki Patín is never scared to go there, right? I'm always gonna take it there. I'm always gonna that's just how my personality is built. And thankfully I found careers and I found other things that accommodate that, right? And support that. So when I heard that this was happening, it reminded me of the fact that every time I have stepped into a creative space, people get weird. And as an artist, that's a barrier for me. At the end of the day, I don't really care what you think about what I write, whether you like it or not, whether it resonates or not. I feel like that's everybody's personal opinion. But if I don't write well enough for you to even have an opinion, like if the quality of my writing is a barrier, which is why you go to graduate school to write, right? Is not what to write. You learn how to write, how to strip off those barriers of communication. So whatever it is you have to say to people, the truth of that shines. And what was happening for me is that I would get in a workshop space and even performance space. And everybody's ick around sexual violence was actually the barrier for me learning how to be a better writer, right? I couldn't get to technique. I couldn't get to strategy. I couldn't get to any of that because I had the big mountain of everyone's ick and discomfort around rape to battle through first. And once I got through all that ick, by that point, I was exhausted. I couldn't even get to like my work. And it felt really unfair. First of all, my artistic career kind of gets stopped in its tracks because I have to go take care of like this dude who's being exploitative and like, you know, actively harming a teenage girl. And I have to like tackle that. So then I get through all that. And then I get like into graduate school. And now I can't get what I need out of graduate school because everybody's like, oh my God, she's talking about you. What did you? Like, bro, like, can I just have everybody calm down so I can like be a better version of me? Like, that's all I'm trying to be is like work on me, right? So I came up with Surviving the Mic because I just wanted to be in a room with other Black women who were spoken word artists, other Black women who had experienced sexual violence. And I wanted to put us together in a room, not only with each other's work, I also wanted to put us together in a room with the work of other Black women poets who were talking about this. And I wanted to put us in the room with history and with data, right? Because the one thing about sexual violence, when you start to explore it, it is the rabbit hole that is never ending. And the more you learn about it, the more that you discover how institutional it is, how organized it is, and how much it's actually not the individual fault of the people who are impacted by it as victims. And even though this might be a controversial statement, I can't even put 100% on the blame of people who are perpetrators and predators when they are raised and reared and shaped in a world that encourages them and benefits them to be that way, right? So when I look at all of that, and when I looked at all of that, I said, oh, we got to be in the rooms together so that we can understand the context of this thing and stop just blaming ourselves, right? We have to stop looking at us as like, I'm the problem, when this is clearly, and let me just also preface this by saying my work is definitely situated through a lens that prioritizes Black women and girls, full stop, period. And so that's how I'm going to talk about this, because that's the way that I came to this work. And so I said, we need to be together and we need to look at all of this information. We need to look at all this history, all this data. We need to write our own work, share our own work, and we need to like be able to do it together. Now, back then I said we needed a safe space together, right? That's the language that I used. And for a couple of years, we did that. And so when we first started Surviving the Mic, that started with a 10-week writing and performance series with other Black women spoken word artists. And we did exactly what I said. We sat together in a room, we looked at poems by other Black women poets, we looked at history, we looked at data, we created work, and we shared it together for 10 weeks straight. It was glorious. Funded by the Walk Literary Foundation, met together at Great Victim Advocates offices. We had one person so into what we were doing that she drove back and forth from Detroit every week for 10 weeks, which was incredible, right? So at the end of the 10 weeks, again, my son's like, I'm like second semester of graduate school, and they're like, hey, we want an open mic. I was like, cool, who's gonna do that? And they're like, oh, well, you know, you did the thing, let's do the thing. And I was like, hey, sure, why not? Let's do it. So we did, and we got a space at the store in Wicker Park called Vintage Underground. If you guys have ever been there before, that store is owned by the father of my bass player, Pablo, who now lives in Tokyo, but back then was living in Chicago. And Pablo's dad was like, yeah, y'all can do an open mic amongst the vintage Gucci and Chanel. We go with that. I was like, okay, great. And so we did. We set up chairs. Pablo, Mark, my guitarist, came. They set up DJ equipment, and we had an open mic at the vintage dress shop for like a year. And then we bopped around for a bit. But one thing we discovered through the process of doing the open mic is that we needed some agreement, because what we discovered is that even though we were calling it a safe space, we couldn't promise that, right? We wished it, we wanted it, we aimed for it, and definitely worked for it. But at the end of the day, I could not predict who was going to walk through the door. And once they walked through the door, I couldn't predict what they were going to do. And so we had like some initial agreements, like that's become a pretty standard thing, right? You know, community guidelines, community agreements of like, this is how we're all going to be together and do this work. And we had that. And then I quickly discovered that they were insufficient. And over the years, we discovered just how insufficient they are. And so ultimately, we ended up transforming what we call safe space into what we call brave space. Brave space, the goal of brave space is different, right? So within a brave space, I cannot promise you that you're going to be safe. Within a brave space, and I'll get to this because this is one of our alignments, I can't promise you that you're not going to be triggered. As a matter of fact, like at Surviving the Mic, let's just go ahead and call it, yeah, you're probably going to be triggered. There's probably people right now in this room who are a little triggered, sorry. Like, but that's the nature of this work. So, you know, it's not about resisting that, right? In fact, we lean into that, say, okay, I'm triggered, we know that. We created an alignment around that. One of the first alignments that we created was around consent, right? And it's, again, it's so funny to talk about this stuff now because, again, like almost 10 years ago, people weren't really talking about it like this. So it's interesting to see the evolution of language. Now everybody, consent, my son, consent, mom, boundaries, mom, every time, like all the time. And I think that's a beautiful thing. I think that's good that the conversation is so public. So for us, the brave space model, the goal of brave space is that we don't want anyone walking out of the space more harmed than how they showed up. That's it. That is it, right? If you can get to being brave in that space, and what I say by brave is scared, but I do it anyway. That's my definition of brave. If you can get to brave in that space and maybe share some work or even write some work, that's like a huge victory all the way around, right? But the baseline goal, no one walks out of here more messed up than how they showed up, period, right? The way that we get to that is that for me, so I told you that I became a prevention educator with Great Victim Advocates. So that means that I'm state certified crisis counselor, responder. Like I can, in a pinch, if anybody gets triggered in this space, Kelly is that too. But if, you know, I can also step in and help like de-escalate and help support, help get people to like more resources, like help for the moment, just, you know, get us like to a place where we're like breathing, like hopefully in through the nose and out through the mouth. We're a little like calm down and we can work through like what I call big feelings or tough moments, and to be able to move on with whatever else we have like planned, right? And so we started knowing that that was like in our space. One thing that really struck me was how hard it was for people to articulate boundaries, even as survivors. There's a mentality out there, and it's one that I've seen a lot over the years, where I think people presume that when you say you're a survivor, everybody just automatically feels sorry for you, and the world starts bending over backwards for you, and people start doing everything for you, and everyone feels just so bad for you. That is so far from true. In fact, what I found to be true is the exact opposite. People find out that you're a survivor. Now, all of a sudden, either you become a target because people see you as vulnerable, or people think that you're a liar because people think that what you want and what you're aiming for is to just get their sympathy and their empathy. Or everyone now has turned into a lead character on CSI and clearly has like a mobile fingerprint unit and they're like going from a car or whatever, because now they want to hear your whole story, tell you from top to bottom how the investigation should have gone and what their conclusions are and who in the world should be prosecuted at the end. Wild. Wild. And so we created alignments to offset all of that. And so we started with consent. And here's what it says. So we have all these alignments. They're on our website. If you go to survivingthemic.org, there are 7 of them. One thing about the alignments is that they are always evolving. They are alignments that can be added to. They are alignments that can be taken away from. Just as we evolve with people, culture also evolves with people. And so what we may say today that may be true and feel true, tomorrow might not feel true or be true. So it really just depends on who's in the space. So consent. Here's what we say to folks, and this is at the beginning of every workshop, every open mic, every live performance that we do, we go through these. All boundaries must be respected, especially physical. Consent should never be presumed, especially when it comes to touching, including hugs, holding hands, pats on the shoulder, or high fives. And so this is where we got like, people would just look at us and be like, huh? Even if your best friends are in a relationship, because we're here to discuss sexual harm and practice consent, the expectations in this space are to always ask for consent. So we encourage people, even if you came with someone you knew and they want to hug you after your piece, instead of them just hugging you, that y'all practice asking for and receiving consent. Because we said, where do you get to practice that? We say it a lot. Consent, 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 consent. How comfortable is it? And you can either raise your hand or not raise your hand and mark it off in your head. How comfortable is it to ask for consent? Everybody feel great about it? I got one. Awesome, right? I feel pretty good about it. I practice it a lot, right? But that's the key word, is practice. Now I'm comfortable. The language feels good to me. It feels right to me. My friends don't look at me like I'm weird when I say it. When I first started this, though, absolutely they did. Oh, they looked at me like I had completely gone off and around the bend. They were like, what you mean ask for consent? I think that's my ride. What you talking about? And I said, well, you should still practice, though. And so that I would say that for all of you, too. Practice it. Might feel weird. It might feel very strange. It might feel very awkward. But I promise, especially if any of you are planning on being parents, practice it now. Practice it now. Practice consent now. And when you have children, absolutely. If you have children, practice it with your children. My son is 10. He has autism. But he is the first one to tell you, don't touch me. I don't need you to, I don't want a hug right now. Please don't tickle me right now. Please don't do this right now. Please don't touch me there right now. He has very, very good awareness of his consent and his boundaries. And that part of that is because I raised him. Even with me, if I don't make you feel, don't accept it just because I'm your mom. Like even when I help, because I have to help him with bathing and everything like that too. If we get to like, his like private like areas, that's a conversation. And I will ask him, are you okay? If I, oh no, okay, well then you wash. Okay, well I'll turn my back, right? And all of that is about understanding and just really knowing within myself too, that your body, very real boundaries of your body are yours. Nobody should be able to transgress those without your explicit permission, however you want to give that, right? But like one thing I like to say, your body is not a democracy. You're the only person who gets a vote. Normally, I'm not really into fascism at all, except when it comes to this right here, okay? Don't want to hear it, don't want to talk about it, not really interested in your opinion on it. It goes for my mama too, she'll be the first one. Oh, that's too tight, that's too this, and? Are you sure you're gonna wear this, and? Are you sure you're gonna, yes? Now I'll do it just because you said something about it, right? It's important to know that and to remember that and to keep that in mind when it comes to the bodies of other people. And we are raised in a place where we really do and are told that, you know, folks get a vote. They get a vote on how you look. They get a vote on who can touch you. They get a vote on whether or not you should touch yourself and how often and all that good stuff, right? They get a vote on all of that apparently, but actually no, like the first sign of liberation is knowing and understanding. When it comes to all of this, your vote's the only one that matters. Remember I said something about trigger warning. You probably would think that I'd be like the king of trigger warnings, right? That I would just talk about trigger warnings everywhere. There'd be one on the side of my car, like the whole. I actually don't believe in trigger warning, and we do not use them at Surviving the Mic, and I'm going to tell you why. First thing is what I said earlier. There's no way that people are not going to be triggered in our space. We're talking about stuff that at its heart actually should be triggering. It should trigger something. If it's not something of your own experience or something from your own life, then it's probably something that you watched or you read, or it's probably like an opinion that you might have, or a feeling, or your empathy. Something should be triggered when you talk about sexual violence. If you're not triggered on some level, I wonder how connected you are to the issue or how much you even know about it. If there's nothing inside you that goes off, that makes you be like, oh my God, like this is like a thing. I need to be really careful with how I maneuver around this. The other thing that we say to people is that folks who share what they share might use language or imagery that could be triggering. And we're not so presumptuous to assume that we can predict every person's triggers. So that's the other thing. I'm not arrogant. I have no idea what can trigger people. It could be anything. It could be a smell. It could be a song. It could be a color. It could be the shoes that I'm wearing, my earrings. Like you just don't know. And from what I've heard over the years and me being a survivor myself, pretty much anything can be a trigger. So the point is not to warn you, right? Because even warning you doesn't prevent you from being triggered. The point is feeling supported while you're navigating. The point is knowing that you have support while you are navigating your triggers. The point is knowing that there are resources that you can access maybe after you've navigated that trigger, that you might need some additional support for that, right? And so we encourage that. We encourage people during our work to do whatever they need to do to take care of themselves. We encourage people to get up and walk out if they can't handle what's being shared. And you don't have to pause and tell us what's going on. You don't have to say, excuse me, or anything. You just get up and go. Go get a drink of water, take a deep breath. If you actually just need to leave and come back on another date, fine, right? And giving people that permission was also really huge for us, because most people, you know, in performance spaces and workshop spaces, people can be real precious. Like really precious. Like you look away for a second and somebody's feelings are hurt. You walk out of the door, oh my God, you're so rude. Like, you know, and people don't give room to the fact that humans are human and they're human. And sometimes in the middle of a performance or a workshop or whatever, something happens that triggers someone or upsets someone or whatever, and they just gotta go, right? And giving people, especially survivors, permission to take that kind of power and control over their emotional well-being, to say, hey, you can go. And not only is that okay, we're not going to be resentful. We're not going to be mad. We're not even going to say anything new about it the next time unless you want to say something. We might be like, might check in and be like, hey, are you okay? Is everything all good? But that's about it. And we never put anybody's stuff like on blast. We would also never address anything like that within itself. We're always going to like step outside, step to the side, take people to the side. And we always have resources available in the space for us. Right? So you don't have to wait till later. You don't have to wait for a link. It's like right there. Back in the day, we would have like a binder that would have literally things you could like photograph. Now we've like moved on to like QR codes. Like we have like an online like resource directory that like dynamically changes every month as people add like new things to it. And it's also not like your standard resource directory either. There are also healing resources in there too, like trauma-informed massage therapists, like trauma-informed like other counselors that are not necessarily like institution-based. This goes so far beyond just finding a therapist. This is also about other ways and means that you can like heal yourself and take care of yourself. Then we go to when folks come to the mic. And this is an important alignment, because when you navigate through survivorhood, some of us have a hard time being seen by people or known by people. And it also can be really hard to just share your tough stuff with people. But we encourage people in whatever way they want to introduce themselves to our Surviving the Mic family. And it could be a nickname, it could be a stage name, whatever it is. We're not precious about that either. But we like people to tell them how they want us to address them. We like them to tell us their pronouns. And then we also like them to tell us whether or not we have permission to document that, to take their photo or videotape that. That's a big one, right? And it was not always in place. And so I want to talk about this for a second. So I told you we started off with a 10-week workshop. We were funded by the Loft Literary Foundation out of Minnesota. And I wrote the grant for that. And one of the things that I wrote to the grant was actually, it's in the wagon. It's this big fancy camera, Canon TS Rebel, never forget it. And I was so excited because I had never had a professional camera before. So backdrop to me as an artist, I've always had to do all my own stuff. This is why I'm a self-taught graphic designer, photographer, like the whole thing. I'm basically like Dick Van Dyke, but like digital version, right? Like if you've ever seen the one-man band with the whatever I got my camera right here, my graphic design here, a microphone hanging here, whatever you need. And I was really excited to take photos, really nice high resolution photos of survivors, because I said, oh, everyone has an opinion of what survivors look like. And that opinion is never me or people who look like me. So I was like, we got to take pictures of ourselves to show people, hey, we're survivors too, right? And then we got to our, I think, second feature. Came up to me right before the open mic, right? So right before this show. And she said, hi, you can't take any pictures. And I said, I'm sorry, what? We're bringing fancy camera. What are you talking about? She said, no, you can't take any pictures. And I said, but why? She said, well, part of what I've experienced has some trauma around cameras and the sound of a shutter. And I said, the sound of a shutter. She said, yeah, if I hear a shutter, my hand's gonna fly out and it'll hit the first person in my path. So not only can you not take pictures of me, you also can't take pictures of anybody who's performing at the open mic, because I will snap whoever's closest. Yep, that's basically what I said. I was like, okay, all right, okay, no camera. And then I thought more deeply about it, and I thought beyond sort of my own wishes and dreams as like a producer of an event, because like that's how my brain is organized. I've got event producer brain, and then I've got like survivor trauma informed brain. And for me, the biggest goal is closing the gap. So this is where also a lot of the safe space, brave space methodology comes from, is closing that gap between my producer brain and my trauma informed brain. And I said, okay, obviously no camera. And then that became one of the alignments, because I started thinking more about it. I said, even if you don't have shutter sound as a trigger for you, what if there's some other, what if there's some other reason why you just don't want to? Maybe you don't want everybody to know that you're a survivor. Maybe you don't like the way your face looks. Maybe if the camera's in your face, you're not going to be able to tell your story. And so then that's where we got the, let us know if we can document you or not. And you can let us know in the moment, you can let us know ahead of time. But we wanted to give that, because there's right now, especially in the world, y'all know, when you're in public, legally, anybody can videotape you, photograph you, record you, whatever, legally. What we've discovered through this process, though, is that just because something is legal doesn't necessarily mean just because it's legal also doesn't necessarily mean that it's ethical. So if we're saying, hey, we're a brave space, and if we're saying, hey, we're trauma informed, if we're saying we do this because we are centering survivors and we are centering their voices and we're centering what they want, there's no way in the world that I could produce a space where I could just be taking photos, videos, whatever, of people willy-nilly, even though I'm legally well within my rights to do that. Morally and ethically, not cool at all. So we made it in alignment, and we say it, we read it out to people at every single event that we do. Why do we do that? For us, it is really important to let people know that they have power. And of course, there's a difference between personal power and other kinds of power. But in our space as survivors, you have a lot of power. You have the power to determine how you want to be in this space. You also have the power to articulate to us how you would like to engage with other people in this space. You say, no pictures, no photos, then that's it. That's all. Even when we do editing workshops, we give people the opportunity to say, here's the kind of feedback that I would like, right? Because how many times have you been in like a workshop space with someone and they start giving you all this feedback and you discover that everything that they're saying to you isn't even helpful? That's not even what you were looking for, right? Like it matters. And with work like this, especially when probably there's not a ton of other spaces where you're going to be able to workshop pieces like that, we want to make sure that people get the most out of that space that they can. So we give our survivors a lot of room to articulate, and we listen, and we put that into what we do. The next piece what I said about like not being like CSI, like secret CSI, a lot of people in the beginning really approached our work, especially at open mics like that. So this alignment, and it's worded now very respectably on the website. But the way that I say it and how I've always stopped into it, and again, excuse my language, I would say we don't dig into people's shit. We don't. Like, I don't have an interest in that. And that came out of an experience where we were hosting the open mic at my house one month. And a friend of mine was the feature, older white woman, and she read stories and told stories about the sexual violence she experienced. And there was a person in the audience in my home who is a very well-known spoken word artist, young Black woman in Chicago, and she started grilling this. Well, are you sure that the person who you're accusing of this felt like that about it? Or are you sure that this and this and this happened, like in front of an audience? Like there's people sitting and we're all listening, and she's asking all these really hard and intense questions, and I was mortified. I felt horrible. I felt horrible for my friend who did not come here for that. And I felt horrible for not articulating, which I actually didn't think I needed to articulate. You don't do that with somebody's experience. You don't pretend like you're like the PI or like that's not anybody's place in this space. And so the way we talk about it now is that we want our space as a brave space. We want people to be vulnerable, but we also want to care for and respect that vulnerability. Nobody owes us that. And I think in this world that is very, we live in a very confessional kind of world, right? Where like anybody can open their camera and kind of confess their deepest, darkest secrets. And there's like, at least on TikTok, like an audience of like, thousands, possibly millions, who will like kind of tap into whatever schadenfreude you're like throwing at the lens, right? That's not how we work at Surviving Life. We consider any contribution to the space an act of generosity. And we're grateful for it. So however much, however little of your story you want to tell is fine. If you don't want to tell your story, right? Maybe you've written an allegory that alludes to what you've been going through. Maybe it's a haiku, maybe it's a word, maybe it's a phrase, maybe it's a whatever. Maybe you say something or you tell something or you spit a poem that literally has nothing to do on the surface with sexual violence. I don't, right? The space is for survivors. Nobody owes me their story. Nobody like owes answers to anyone. And we don't leave room for that. So folks can come, they can perform, they can do what they do. And whatever it is that they offer, we just say thank you. And that's it. And that's one of the ways that we keep people brave in our space, because they know that they don't have to prove up whatever it was that happened to them. And a note about that, because people are always very, very concerned about liars, about what happened. I also don't give it, I don't care about that. And I'm going to tell you, if somebody has gone out of their way to access Surviving the Mic as a survivor, or as anyone, and they are so moved to share something, and whatever it is that they share, it's discovered later on is not true, whatever, what have you. Again, I don't care. And I'm going to tell you the reason why I don't care is because we created Surviving the Mic to be a brave space, and people show up in that space however it is that they want to show up. And if something makes you come to a space that you know is specifically designed for survivors of sexual violence, and you know that all over our materials, it's all over how we talk about ourselves as a space and as an organization, and you still decide to show up and you still decide to share, you clearly need something out of that space. You need something. And it's not for me to determine what it is that you need. It's not even necessarily like for me to give you what you need, right? Because it's not about me or even anyone. It's about like that collective energy and how we're gathering together and holding space together as a community. And that's what I think makes these alignments so powerful. The reason why we don't call them guidelines, we don't call them rules or anything like that, is because it's not about the sort of punitive nature, right? Which is something that I associate with safe spaces. It's punitive. If you don't do it the right way, if you're not being appropriately safe, if you make someone feel unsafe, there's a punishment for you. There's a consequence for you. Cool. Some spaces might need that. That's not how we do it in Surviving Life. I, by nature, am not a punitive person. I, by nature, am pretty resistant to consequences on that level. Even as a parent, I don't really operate and function that way. I'm one of those annoying, newfangled, gentle people, right? So even as I'm a program director for another nonprofit. Even my staff there I don't micromanage them, and I'm not really big on like punishment per se. And especially with work like this, we're showing up because we want to, right? We're showing up because we've decided that we want to be together in this space. And so that's why we call these alignments, because they either align with your spirit and they align with your values, or they don't. And it's up to you to make that call. That's also why they're on our website. That's why anybody can look at them, read them, even come email us, ask questions about them well before they show up in person or even virtually. Because it's not for me. Like for me, that feels very much like policing. And there are certain folks that are into that, and they are into running spaces like that. They're into like managing energy in that way. There's a lot of room for them on this planet to do that. But to do what we do and to do things in the way that we do it, there's far fewer spaces. And so I'm not interested in bringing the energy of policing into the surviving the life space. We never have. And the few issues that we've had over the years, like we were seeing monologues, which was really scary and upsetting. But other than that, we've never had an issue with people violating our space in that way. People are actually super respectful when they show up to Surviving the Mic. And they're careful. They're careful with themselves. They're careful with each other. They're considerate. And that is what to me matters the most about a brave space, is there is a certain level of consideration, right? So that's also a thing when it comes to bravery. Being scared but doing it anyway, right? Nobody really talks about the after you do it anyway part. Because in some ways that's the hardest part. The ramping up to it and I'm getting ready to do it. And I think I'm brave enough to do it, right? Like there's a lot of people usually around for that moment, hopefully, and to hype you up and to like get you going and all that. But after you do the thing, after you've been brave, that's usually when folks like peace out, right? And you're kind of left to like process through this brave thing that you just did and the impact of that. And so for me, thinking about the consideration of that and being considerate around that is something that I really have carried through this practice of surviving the mic the whole way. So anytime we have ever presented this open mic, we have always had an advocate in the space. We always do our best to have water at minimum in the space to make sure that people at the very least can hydrate if they're having a hard moment. A lot of stuff, tough feelings come up. People get upset. There are physical aspects to that, right? So I think when people think about getting upset, they just think about like the emotional part of it. You feel upset, might be crying, but people don't think about the physical piece to it, right? I can tell you as somebody who has complex PTSD and has experienced a number of like symptoms and physical symptoms around this, it can get pretty gross. Like you get triggered and you might get an intense headache. For me, I know I'm getting anxious when my body temperature spikes immediately. I start like sweating. That can then lead to like nausea. Some people get like physically like ill, right? Some people, their heart rate increases really fast and they feel like they can't catch their breath or like they're gonna like have like a heart attack. Some people get like auditory things, like they're flat, they can hear things, or sometimes like they might hallucinate. Like, there was a moment last year where I was having a really, really hard moment emotionally. I had just bought my first house. A week after I closed on that house, I got fired from the job that I had gotten that had helped me afford that house. And my body's response to that, even though I was moving through and moving and doing all the things that I needed to do, my body had a reaction to that. My brain started glitching, as my psychiatrist called it. And I was freaked out. I was in traffic one day and I was like at a stoplight behind a semi. And I'm waiting for the light to turn red. And it felt like my car was moving. And it wasn't. I thought I was going to slam into the back of a semi truck. And I was like, what is happening? I have never experienced anything like this. When I talked to my psychiatrist, she said, in a very offhanded way for something so terrifying, by the way, she was like, oh, your brain glitched. And I was like, wait, what? What do you, computers glitch? What are you talking about? Like humans don't glitch. What are you talking about? She's like, no, your brain glitched. It's fine. We'll just add this medication to whatever. And you'll be fine. And she was right, but it was still a really terrifying moment. And it impressed upon me even more that there are physical symptoms that are attached to trauma and the aftermath of trauma that don't make themselves known for years, decades. And so that goes back to the consideration that even if you were a survivor, or you're somebody who's friends with survivors, maybe you've navigated through 1.5 million triggers with people, maybe this feels very like comfortable, familiar territory. It's a good reminder that you don't know all the things that are possible. in terms of the fallout of trauma? I don't think any of us do. So that consideration of just being prepared on a basic level. Do we have water? Do we have a place where somebody could step out if they need to and not just be outside in the cold, in the dark, and alone, right? Do we have somebody who can step out with people if they need to? Do we have, you know, our resource guide, right? Those levels of consideration are really important. Other things, we ask people to really watch their words in surviving the mic. Now, this seems like, you know, a basic one, and I can run the whole list. You know, we don't do any language that is racist, transphobic, homophobic, sexist, ableist, including language that stigmatizes those navigating illness, sizes, ages, classes, victim blaming, slut shaming, etc. We don't do language that targets like specific like people or like groups of people. And this is also a very like, this was a tough lesson that we like keep learning, because we've had moments in workshop where I remember one time somebody was really on a tear about straight people and how annoying straight folks are. And while I don't disagree, I had to like throw up the break and be like, but you can't actually say that in workshop space. And they were like, well, why? And I'm like, for the same reason I can't talk about how I find white people annoying occasionally in workshop space. And they were like, well, why? I'm like, that might be true for me. But talking about white people as a group is not okay. Now, if I want to talk about white supremacists, right? That's different, right? That's a conceptual, like, you know, cultural situation, right? But me talking about white people as a group within this group without grounding it in some history, in some data, in some like, you know, just analysis that goes beyond the people, right? You have to look at like what's, you know, what's driving the thing that might be like annoying, right? Like I could tell you what's driving the thing behind like being annoyed by straight people. That would be heterosexism. Straightness is everywhere. Like it's predominant. It's all over the place, right? And so we can talk about that, right? But it was important for me to draw what seems like very, very ticky, annoying, irritating, like little lines around these things so that we can be sure that when we are having these conversations, that people who are in that space can continue to feel brave. We have white folks that show up to surviving the mic. We have straight folks that show up to surviving the mic. I have to remember that those folks are also survivors, right? Even though they might have some privileges in other ways, they are also survivors. And so the goal is to keep everybody in that space. And so that's why, again, we have to be considerate and careful about the language that we use. And so when folks are using abusive, that like language that's abusive, we don't support the use of it. But again, the way that we like deal with that, and especially like the work that we really had to deal with over the years is work that's been gratuitously violent or gratuitously like hypersexualized. That's like a real big thing that can come out, like, you know, with work from survivors. We never, again, confront people within the group. We never within the group call someone out or say, oh my God, you said this or that, like, because again, we consider that to be policing. We consider it to be harmful. And so what we do is that we take that person to the side, we sort of check in with them and figure out what's going on. And then we also like check in with the group and see how the group is doing, and not in a witch hunt sort of way, but just in like a temperature check. Is everyone feeling okay? Is there anything that anyone needs to unpack? Again, we're careful and considerate about the ways that we unpack even harmful or abusive like moments. It's our goal to call people in gently and to sort of let them know why or how their language or expression could be felt as harmful to other people. And so again, this is space, and the space of surviving the mic is to provide that opportunity for self-awareness and for accountability. At the end of the day, like, although we are not a clinical space, like we also are about healing, and we want people to like heal. You know, the thing about surviving the mic, we don't expect people to stay with us or to stick with us for forever. Sort of like a way station on like the road to healing, in ways that many other spaces are, in ways that this space will be, right? So like, we wouldn't expect that like you as a student, you would just be in here posted like all day, every day. Maybe this is the space that you come to when you need it, or if your friend needs it, or whatever it is that you might need. We try to view it in that way. Last but and definitely not least, it has to do with our accessibility and our affirmation of folks. So we definitely are all about affirming and I don't like to use the word accept, but affirming and confirming and making space for folks who are LGBTQ. I myself am, you know, gender nonconforming, I'm queer. So that was always going to be in the DNA of what we do. Also, it's important to us to be accessible to neurodivergent folks on multiple levels, whether that's, with mental health and wellness, development, whatever that is, usually, whatever we have, especially online, we try to like caption that. We have brought like ASL interpreters in for our work before. We're part of like the Chicago Accessibility Network so that we can stay on top of that. And then we also really like for folks to let us know too, if they have difficulty navigating stairs, if they need to use a wheelchair, whenever we book public presenting spaces, that's really important to us, that we don't have that we always have a space that is physically accessible to folks who might, use any sort of physical aids, whether it's a wheelchair, whether it's braces, a cane, whatever it is, and also making sure that whatever space we have, it's accessible so that more than one person in a wheelchair can be in that space at one time. People think people in wheelchairs don't have friends, or that the friends they have don't also have wheelchairs, but they do. So we like to think about that and think through that too. We spend a lot of time thinking about that. There are a lot of us who are part of the Surviving Mike that we like to call neurospicy, including myself. So we, are really just, we really like to be, again, considerate about that and to think about that and to leave room to articulate around that, and not in a way that makes people feel like they have to climb up such a huge mountain just to get what they need. A good friend of mine, Baraka De Soleil, who is a beautiful dancer and contemporary artist, I think it was actually on the UIC campus that he did a workshop here. And what was interesting is that the workshop space, so Barak uses a wheelchair, and when people entered the workshop space, all they found was like a pile of chairs in it. And the way that the workshop started was that people had to figure out how to get a chair to the place that they wanted where they could sit comfortably and see what they needed to see. And they had to work with the staff of the space in order to get that done. So they couldn't just like grab a chair and put it wherever. They had to actually navigate what folks who are often advocating for when they're advocating for their own accessibility. He put them through their own experience with that so that they could understand what that's like. And so in some ways, that's what we do with Surviving Life. That's why we say, ask for consent, practice consent. It's why we go through these alignments pretty much every time, because we want people to understand the level of care and concern that it takes to actually keep people brave. It's not something that you can just wish. It's not something that you can have the intention around. You do have to put labor and thought and not just intention into it. You have to like very much like the land acknowledgement. It's not just like a verb, right? And it's not just a nice like wish. It's something that we actively have to work for and ask for and demand of with each other. There are plenty of times where folks, myself included, have been out of alignment with the alignment. And so it's also important to do like a self-check as well and hold yourself accountable with how you're aligning. It's a practice, right? And so I think like out of anything, if there's anything that I can leave y'all with, is that when it comes to this space as a brave space, think about what it would take someone to be scared, but to do it anyway. And let that be in many ways like one of your guiding, principles, is to think about what that would take and think about it for yourself too. That if there's something that you would love to do in this space or with this space, or a way that you'd like to access the space, but you don't feel like you see the model for it, you don't necessarily feel comfortable asking for it, ask yourself what it would take for you to be brave enough, but to do it anyway. And what kind of support would it need in order for that to happen? For me, I can say, as now an artist and a writer and somebody who has been, sharing really vulnerable stories for over 2 decades, I was not always the bravest person. As a matter of fact, when I first started spoken word, I was so nervous that the paper would shake in my hands. It would rattle loudly, and it rattled so loudly that that's why I started memorizing my work back in the day, because it was the only way I could get through poems without like the literal visual presentation of my nervousness being a barrier to my work. Over time, I learned to do things like manage my breathing, figure out, where are my points to look at in the room. Like I came up with an entire sort of like collection of strategies that I used to cope with my own anxiety and my own fear. And then eventually I was able to move past that and actually like just be brave. So in many ways too, bravery is a practice. And so I also invite you to like really meditate on that. That when it comes to like this space, which is really incredible, by the way, that like you have this space here that's specific to survivors of sexual violence on this campus. I invite you to suspend your notions and your assumptions about who a survivor is, what a survivor is, what it means to be a survivor, people's different journeys when it comes to survivorhood, and how they navigate that. Because I can tell you from personal experience, the journey through surviving, and not just sexual violence, but any kind of trauma, is a very much like individual journey. The one thing that we can collectively agree to as a community are what are the considerations that we need to keep people on their pathway to healing, and to make sure that when they show up around us, they don't leave more harm than how they show. Questions, thoughts, feedback, or just a deep breath. I know I can. Mm-hmm.
Welcome to the.
Can I ask, sorry, whoever is speaking, can you come into the room and can you speak sort of toward the microphone here? So anyone who's going to ask a question, I would love, oh, sorry, Rachel, I just totally put you on the spot. But I would love for folks to kind of turn their heads a little bit so that our friends that are joining us via Zoom can also hear you. The mic is on the back wall here in this funky little bar. That is totally fine, as long as you're sort of facing that. Thank you, Rachel.
Okay, yeah,
Appreciate it.
I was looking at the Nikki and I saw the 10,000 prints.
Oh, labyrinth.
Section, yeah, labyrinth. Can you tell me a little bit more about like what inspired you to do that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. That's a that's a great and unexpected question. So labyrinths are a big part of just my practice as a human. I actually have one tattooed on my forearm, and I got the idea to tattoo this labyrinth from a book that I read called a book that I read by Alice Walker, and she talks about the beauty and the power of labyrinth. And one of the coolest things about labyrinths is that it's like a maze, right? I don't know if you guys can see it, but it's like a maze. And this one on my arm, you actually can like navigate it. The cool thing about this, and I've actually walked one in real life, is that navigating through a labyrinth always makes you feel like you're going backwards because it's a circle and you have to like double back. So if you start right here, you're gonna come here and then you'll go this way, then to go forward, you have to just keep doubling back and forth and back and forth. And on my arm, it feels like one thing, but I can tell you right now, I walked one in wine country in Napa at a conference, and I'm up in the mountains and I'm walking the labyrinth and I'm like ready for lunch. And I'm like, okay, I'll walk the labyrinth real quick. And I'm like walking and I'm walking like, well, damn, like I keep walking and I keep passing the same places and I can just not, and you just have to stay the course until you get out of the thing. And it's really maddening because you keep seeing all the places where you just walked before. And you're like, damn, I should really be further. I keep looking at the same stuff that I've been looking at. But one thing that I discovered about labyrinth, much like the nature of our solar system, is that actually, if I think about it not as a flat sort of 2D like maze, but I think of it more as a spiral. And then every time I am doubling back, I am actually doubling into and doubling back onto deeper and deeper levels of consciousness and awareness. That's where the concept of me applying labyrinth as a practice to my own life came from. Now, what you're talking about is the visual arts project that came out of that. And it's so funny because I never bring my sketchbook up with me, but I have my sketchbook with me so you guys can actually see what she's talking about. In 2021, I started a visual meditation every morning where I create labyrinths. And this is basically looking at my brain and how I am like helping to heal and soothe it. And it's very simple. I know there's some engineering students in here. Please don't look at this and then try and assume correct angles or anything mathematically, whatever. I'm a writer for a reason. But I take like a compass and a ruler and I just make lines and circles and patterns and they come out in different ways. And I have alcohol-based markers and I fill in the patterns in whatever colors like call to me. And I've been doing this every morning for a couple of years now. And my goal is that before I transition from this life, that I will have 10,000 of these completed. Why 10,000? Because they say 10,000 of anything. Thank you. Thank you.
Are there any questions from Zoom?
Yeah, Zoom folks, chime in. Tap in, please.
And I did have a question.
Yeah.
This is Kelly. I was wondering, so, I work with survivors and I often am sharing your website, your information with survivors. We're often talking about the power of writing one story and telling it, saying it out loud, saying it to a friend. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, to someone who maybe has never done that before, what that might mean for them and maybe how that might help or foster healing as they're moving through their healing journey.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. That's a great question. So before I was a spoken word artist, I started when I was 19. I started writing when I was 7 and wrote consistently. I started reading when I was 2. So I've had a love affair with words for my whole life. And so there's a good 12-year gap between me putting words on paper and me putting words through a microphone. I can tell you from personal experience, there is a huge leap that happens when you bridge the gap between your words on your paper and then articulating those words into the air. As I tell my son all the time, words are spells. So whatever it is that you say, whatever it is that you articulate, that to me, there's some magic there. There's some alchemy that goes on there. I have no idea what the science or the nature of that is behind that, but I can tell you right now, as somebody who's been articulating things into the air for quite a long time, there's a powerful healing thing that happens when you are actually able to speak it aloud. Not even just speak it aloud. There's something that also, so there's a reason why I also have a microphone on my forearm, and that is a Shure SM58 microphone. It is a very specific microphone that is the most used microphone on the planet. Wherever I perform, New Zealand, Australia, UK, Geneva, wherever you want, New York, LA, Chicago, Detroit, wherever, they always have, I'm sure you could find one on this floor here in this building, a Shure SM58 microphone. It's amazing. The beautiful thing about amplification and the beautiful thing about being a survivor with amplification is that 9 times out of 10, that's going to happen on a stage, right? And it's going to happen usually in front of an audience full of people. I said a lot of controversial, very bold things on stage, things that I'm sure people absolutely disagree with. Guess what happens though when I'm on a stage with a microphone in my hand? Not a damn thing unless I say so. There is a power there. There is a reclamation of story and of truth there that's hard to get to anywhere else and any place else. It's one of the reasons why I pushed myself to practice as a spoken word artist. When I first got started, I was actively told at the second open mic I ever went to by a table full of people who have now won Pulitzers and are world renowned. And if I dropped a couple names, you'd be like, oh yeah, I know who they are. They literally were like, they got together and they sent up one of their people. And she told me face to face, go home, you suck, we don't want you to come here. And as a matter of fact, we want you to leave. We don't ever want you to come back. And I was gutted. First of all, I was 19 sneaking into a bar. So these were like grown-ups, like 30. Who were speaking to me as a 19-year-old. And I was like, man, you guys are so mean. This is my dream. What are you doing? You know, and they did not care at all. They're like, oh no, you're terrible. Just go home. And thank God that this woman said that to me. Her name's Maria McCrae. She was a legendary Chicago poet, 50-year-old Black woman who was a Vietnam vet who reads some of the best poetry I ever heard in my life. And I was an instant fan of her. So not only was I told that by somebody who was very well established, I was told that by somebody who I literally idolized. And when she told me that, I went home and I made a decision that night. And I said, oh, there's something about my voice that seems to really bother y'all. I'm definitely coming back. I'm coming back every single week. And y'all can't tell me to leave because it's an open mic. Like, if you don't want to be an open mic, call it a closed mic. But y'all said it was an open mic. So I'm coming back. Y'all gonna have to build a bridge and get right on over it. And that's what I did. And I did that for 3 years. Same open mic, Monday night, every week. And the same person taking the names at the open mic would look at me every Monday night, every week for 3 years. And I'd say, hi, I'd like to be on the list. And she'd go, and you are? And I would say the same thing, Nikki Patín, and they would never write my last name down. They call me Nikki P. They couldn't remember my last name or how to say it, which was devastating and gutting. And then I got a feature, right, and all that thing. But the reason why I got that is because I carried a stopwatch around my neck. And I practiced, and I wrote, and I rewrote, and I practiced again, and I refused to yield the microphone. And the reason why I did not want to yield the microphone is because whatever gets amplified is typically the story that gets told. It is the story, right? So speaking up and being willing and able to articulate it through the air where people have to hear it and they can't deny it unless they just walk out of the room was extremely powerful for me. And over the years, even as I was addressing things like body image and sexuality and racism, the one thing that I could never, ever, ever get to was sexual violence. I couldn't write about my own experiences with rape until I started Surviving Mike. And there are folks now, Moshe Stokely, who's another one of the executive directors of Surviving Mike, she was in that first cohort of Surviving Mike. And Mojde had already had a well-established poetry slam career, all of that well beforehand. But until she got into that workshop, she could not call herself a survivor. She could not write about those experiences. There was something that happened on a healing level for all of us when we were able to claim it and put it through the speakers. That was very different than just writing about it on paper. So I think like for folks who are sort of on the fence or very scared or worried, I can understand that because it is reclamation of power and control over yourself, over your narrative, over your story, that for people who have experienced a stripping away of that, for people who have been made to feel powerless, for people for whom their control has been just taken away and they don't feel like they have power, probably in a lot of spaces in their lives, to willingly step into a space where the power is literally in your hand, right? It's a super powerful experience. And for the most part, people do just have to take in your story. And they can't, if they're going to question you, they're going to have to do it later, one-on-one, and whatever. But while you're on that stage telling that story, it is you and it's that story and it is what it is.
First of all, thank you for such a powerful speech. My first speech is part of love, I'm sure all of us did. I want to say, so I am the director of diversity and inclusion for undergrad students, and I always mention that we want to create UIC safe space for all the students. But I want to ask you a recommendation that how can we achieve that? How can we create UIC more safe space, or as you mentioned, great space for our students?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great question. Congratulations. That's a wonderful role to be in. I mean, I think that consideration is key. That's like the number one thing. It's just being considerate and sort of thinking through all the things, right? That can sort of come with that. Also, I think taking some of the pressure off yourself and not feeling like you need to be the one that knows all the things or that knows how to do all. I think one of the beautiful things that came out of the Surviving Life experience was me discovering that I didn't have to do it by myself. And that really what I could do was also listen to other survivors and recognize that survivors, much like any group, are not alone. And so that was a big part of the process too, was figuring out that what I needed, like I needed to be documented. I needed this, I needed that. Other people didn't need that. They needed other stuff. So I think opening the conversation up too and asking students too, what would help you feel safe? What would make this a safe space for you? Or what would make this a brave space? And then really being open to that conversation and also open to the knowledge that that also might change, right? So what feels safe to someone today might not feel safe to them next time. And being really open to that and open to it being kind of dynamic. And also I think too, within that, giving yourself a lot of room and a lot of like grace too. Because I think what can be really hard when you're the person who's sort of the leader of the space, everybody expects that you're going to predict what everyone's going to do. You're prepared for every single situation. You know how to handle every single thing. And that's just not realistic, right? Like so, giving yourself the grace to understand that and for yourself figuring out like, okay, how am I like accountable, but also how am I being like self-protective too? How am I like making sure I'm not also harmed in this process too is a big one. And then, yeah, just opening those channels for folks to tell you how they can feel safe.
Are there any more questions? One last one. Okay. Can we all thank Nikki? So besides like offering us, I think, not only the story of surviving the night, the kind of process, but also sharing your incredible story and leadership in shaping like what that has become in Chicago. And so I want to say thank you. We also have a lot of people to thank for actually making this event.
It's yourself.
I forgot. Details. Hi, everybody. I'm Natalie Bennett, the director for the Women's Leadership and Resource Center in the Campus Advocacy Network.
Natalie, do you want to move over here so you can speak to the Zoom
Oh,
folks?
no.
Is my
Yes,
my
please.
I
Just stand here. Okay.
This is easy.
Hi, Zoom folks.
Oh.
We back up. Maybe here.
Or you can,
Should I sit down? There's a whole performance happening. Yeah.
you're fine, you're fine, you're fine. Okay, now I gotta read.
Okay, so I wanted to just briefly thank the folks, the university folks who have committed to making this event happen today, but also who are very much part of the conversation that we're having about what it means to create a brave space at UIC. And so I'd like to name the co-sponsors for the event, the UIC's Black Cultural Center, the English Club, the Department of English, Fraternity and Sorority Life, the Latino Cultural Center, the School of Theater and Music, the Undergraduate Student Government, and of course, the University Library. So I want to thank everybody. For folks who are interested in being part of the conversation about creating a brave space and creating the survival space, there's a QR code that's kind of either coming around or you can pick one up when you leave. Be sure to hang on to that, pass it on to other folks who you think might be interested in getting involved. There are also cookies and refreshments outside, so be sure to pick something up on your way out. We know it's been a long afternoon, but we hope that you feel fed, not just by what has been said and done here, but also with the refreshments that you take with you. And finally, I want to say thank you to you for showing up in a really beautiful way today. Having an audience is just really one piece of the work, and that you were willing to be here and to be part of this conversation, I think, is commendable. So thank you.